If you want to create an easily serviceable planted water feature in your reptiles enclosure that doesn't require complicated plumbing and reduces the need for frequent water changes, this video will help you do it. When building out an enclosure upgrade for my Japanese rat snake Elora, I decided to make a water feature similar to one I'd made for my boa severus, but with some modifications to the design and functionality that would make it better for both my snake and myself. It was a huge improvement, so this video will show you the lessons I learned along the way and take you step by step through the process so you can try it yourself. So instead of this, or even this, you can have this. I hope this inspires you to create something that isn't just pretty to look at, but benefits your animals as well. So let's slither on into it. Snake therapy isn't just about what our animals give to us. It's also about the pleasure in the process of creating for them and about learning new ways of doing so. So no matter how many enclosures I make, I'm always learning and looking for ways to make them better next time. The water feature I built last year for my BCI Severus was definitely an improvement on a simple water bowl and encouraged some positive natural behaviors in him that were a delight to observe. But as time went by, I noticed some design flaws and functionality issues that were frustrating for me. The tutorial I made for that build was one of my most popular videos, so if you watched it and already made something similar, this one might help you make some refinements to that. And if you haven't made one yet but still want to, it might get you amped up enough to make it happen. Before we get to the tutorial though, let's review the issues I wanted to address with the new design. Number one, that last water feature was permanently installed in my enclosure. That may be fine if the enclosure is a forever home, but it does create some limitations. For one, the water feature takes up a lot of space, and Severus is growing fast. So at this point, he has just enough room between it and the door to slither past it towards his hide. If you have an apex enclosure and enough space in your reptile room to expand outwards, that could totally fix the problem. But right now, that's not an option for me. Another issue with the permanent install is that I use silicone to seal the inside of the housing of the tub to the floor. And if your enclosure is PVC, that's a big mistake. Even though everyone uses it, please note that silicone doesn't adhere well to PVC. There have been some instances of very soggy substrate when he's gone swimming and displaced the water from the tub because that seal wasn't complete. The rest of the feature is attached to the back wall with epoxy clay, so without removing him from the enclosure for the time it takes for the correct sealant to cure, it's not safe to reseal it in situ. Conversely, the water feature in this video is a standalone piece, so it can be moved around and taken out if needed, and I used a much more effective sealant. Number two, the water feature utilized a simple electric water pump with its cable running up the wall and out of the cord slots at the top of the enclosure. But this means that I can't remove the pump when it's time to clean without opening up the top of the enclosure, and since it's stacked underneath another one, that's not a possibility. In order to clean the pump, I have to use containers and scrub brushes and do it in place. I don't feel comfortable using chemical disinfectants on something that's in his drinking water without being able to thoroughly rinse it off afterwards. This is especially problematic and unpleasant when Severus decides to use his water feature as a toilet. Big boas make big nasty messes, and when they're run through a pump, just Issue number three, the pump moves the water, but it doesn't filter it. I've tried adding bags of carbon filter pellets, carbon sponge media, and I've used Reptisafe to treat the water. But I still need to do pretty frequent water changes to prevent bacteria and algae from building up. And changing all 3+ gallons of water and cleaning the tub is a bit of a production. My friend Damon of Family Boide specializes in bioactive enclosures with living water features. They all have filters and our plants in them, and he told me he barely ever needs to do water changes. So after getting some input from him and planning this bioactive build for Elora, that's what I set out to do with this new design, and I'm really pleased with the results. So big shout out and thanks to Damon for his help. Among others, he primarily focuses on viper boas and other Candoya species and has decades of valuable experience and knowledge of bioactive herpetoculture. So make sure you go follow him on Instagram. And he also mentioned he might be starting some YouTube tutorials soon, so keep your eyes out for those as well. Lastly, this build was a massive undertaking beyond just the water feature. It was a specialty 6x2x4 enclosure that Apex made for me, and there's a lot more to it than this video will cover. So if you want to find out how I made the tree or any of the other elements, I'll be releasing detailed tutorials for my supporters on Patreon in the future. These builds are a lot of work, but so are the videos that document them. And Patreon memberships are crucial to my ability to continue making and sharing them. So if you can, please join as a supporting member to help me out and get some extra content and direct support for yourself in the process. You can also support by donating via the Super Thanks button below this video, liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Big thanks to Apex for the amazing custom enclosure, which I do believe will be available as an option for all customers in the future. And now, let's get to building. I used high density urethane for the starting framework of this water feature. HDU is extremely strong and rigid, so you can glue or screw it together like wood or PVC. You could totally still go with XPS foam for this part like I did on my last one though, if HDU isn't available to you. The rest of the structure was made with XPS, and I wanted to make the cover of the water feature sit flush with the tree element I was creating because I planned to have part of it sit on the top of the tree's base. It took a couple tries to make sure the heights were right. I knew that much of this feature would sit below the substrate level, but alignment was crucial. This time, the cover would be in 2 pieces instead of 1, allowing me to extend some of the roots of the tree over it while still making the top and the tub easily removable for cleaning and access. I had to work on my metalworking table to ensure things were on a completely flat surface, and I used a piece of HDU as a stand-in for the back of the enclosure to make sure I could keep the tree and the water feature flush against an upright surface. You could use a piece of wood for this, but just make sure you've propped and affixed it securely at a right angle to the table surface. I used a rasp to shave down the edge a bit where the 2 pieces met. Then I went ahead and carved up some more pieces of foam with my hot knife to create a multi-level rock formation. Always make sure you're wearing a respirator when you carve foam with a hot knife. The specific texture of the rock here wasn't important for me since I would be covering everything in epoxy clay later, but I wanted to make some definitive shapes and dips in the overall form to follow with the clay. As you can see, the left side would sit flush on the tree base, and I cut the top into 2 sections once I had a layout I felt good about. Next was labeling and outlining each of my pieces so that I could make sure to put them back in the right place after the glue had been applied. I used a serrated knife to rough up the surfaces where the pieces would be joined and applied Lexol adhesive and used toothpicks to keep the pieces together while the glue cured. With Lexol, it also helps to spray it with some water and even spread out the glue with your gloved fingers or a tool before you press the pieces together. After 24 hours, the glue was cured and I could remove the toothpicks. I decided that I wanted to cut away more space from the cover to expose more of the water surface, so I marked that up for removal while it was in place. For the time being, the 2 halves were connected with toothpicks so they'd stay aligned. I kept the tub for the water inside of the frame while I did all this, so I didn't accidentally cut too much away and expose the plastic. The frame was large enough that I probably didn't need to do this, but just to make it that much easier to remove, I marked where I would carve away an area in the base frame for my fingers to be able to get under the lip of the tub. Next, I'd add some foam to beef up the outside of the frame. Since I'd be using both XPS and spray foam for this, it was crucial to add wax paper to the underside of the cap so that the spray foam wouldn't adhere to it. I would be keeping the top on to make sure the outside lined up nicely with it. I don't like using too much spray foam, so I started with a couple of pieces of XPS that I would build around. Note that I have bricks holding down the top of the water feature here, because spray foam is strong and it's going to expand where it can. So I used the bricks to keep it flush as much as possible. I used a reusable spray foam gun, which was a total game changer for this build. It's so much easier to control your foam spray, and it prevents the waste and mess that often comes with using the disposable cans. Mist your foam with water to help it cure faster. Once the foam had cured, I could remove the bricks and get to carving. Jab saws are really nice for the initial foam carving and allow you to swap out blades of different lengths, shapes, and teeth quantity. I've also started sanding down my foam for the final shaping. It helps to control material removal and to smooth out the surface. I decided to raise the level of the tub inside of the frame, so I screwed a couple pieces of leftover PVC I had laying around on the inside. Because Elora is small, I wasn't worried about the water displacement for this one, so I just used enough PVC to evenly support the tub. But if you want to avoid spillage into substrate like I mentioned in the intro, you should use a piece of material that completely fills the bottom of the frame. And instead of silicone, use DAP 230 to seal all the seams. I also covered all the extra holes I'd made and over the heads of the screws to keep them from rusting. I did a bit more detailing to the top, adding a bit more spray foam for some extra shape. Once this was done, I could get to the fun part and start making it actually look like rocks. I now cover all of my builds with Zoopoxy 307 Light epoxy clay. It's non-porous, texturable, paintable, hard as real rock, and creates a waterproof seal over just about any surface. There's just nothing like it if you want really naturalistic looking pieces that are also easy to maintain. Zoopoxy can also cover any cracks or holes and act as a joint to hold things in place. Once cured, it retains heat like rocks do, so it can act as a great basking surface if desired. If you want to see a tutorial on how to work with it, you can watch the video linked in the top right-hand corner of the screen. I also have a more in-depth step-by-step on Patreon. To texture my clay, I use everything from clay tools and concrete stamps to real rocks. It may not look like much before the paint gets added, but once it does, the depth and realism far surpasses anything you can do with foam. Alignment and texture continuity between the different pieces would be an ongoing challenge throughout this build. To make sure the two pieces looked as seamless as possible, I covered over the two parts with clay and textured it first, and then gently cut through the clay at the seam with a thin blade before the clay hardened. I also tried to clean up the edge where it met the wax paper surface so that there wouldn't be too much extra once it dried. As you'll see, there'll still be some work to do to fix that later. Once the first round of clay was hardened, it was time to test fit and see how everything aligned, and decide how to proceed. I was still deciding whether to cover the flat surfaces with clay or not. Once I put things together, I was pretty unhappy with how significant the seam and gap was between the top and the bottom of the water feature. There was also quite a bit of extra material around the edges where it met the table. And not only did I find that an eyesore, it can be a bit sharp. At this point, I decided that the bottom would need to have clay as well, and I'd need to do some extra work to remedy these issues. Using a metal file is one method of smoothing out any sharp edges once the clay is dry, so I started off with that. But it wasn't going to remove a lot of material. So I decided to wait until I had a better sense of how everything would fit before trying a different method. At this point, I had a good start on the base of the tree, so I could put these elements together to check alignment. I noticed that the part of the water feature that would sit on the tree base was not sitting flush. So the next step was to cover the bottom of those pieces with as flat a layer of clay as possible. I would recommend that if you're adding Zoopoxy to XPS that hasn't been textured, use a low grit sandpaper to abrade it a bit first so that the clay will adhere easier. I covered all of the XPS with clay, even the edges that would sit against the wall and not be seen. You could also just seal those parts with a different material, You'll see how I did that to the HDU frame later on in the video. As much as I tried to keep the clay flat, it definitely wasn't once it cured, so I used an orbital sander to smooth out the surface a little bit. Then I used a Dremel tool to remove the excess clay around the inside edge. This is way more effective than a file. But there was still a big old gap between the top and the bottom, and my perfectionism just couldn't leave it like that. My solution was to use aluminum foil to cover the base while adding more clay to the top. As long as the aluminum foil is wet before you start working, you'll be able to pull it off after the clay cures, and the foil would allow me to hug the contours of the base really well to make as clean of a transition as possible. It's not completely seamless, but I thought it was a huge improvement. Last time I did this, I used dowels to create a locking mechanism so that the top couldn't shift out of place by my snake's weight. This time, I didn't need to do that. The weight of the clay, the more seamless fit, and the fact that this is for a smaller bodied species meant that I wasn't as concerned about this issue. But if you are, check out the previous version of this project to see how I did that. I used an abrasive wheel to finish cleaning up the inside edge of the top piece and make it look a bit more natural as an overhang above the water. This creates a lot of dust, so make sure you wear a mask and then either vacuum or blow off the dust before starting on the paint. Here's where things start to really come to life. I use non-toxic acrylic paints to do washes of color. For gray-black rocks, I'll start with the black and make sure it builds up in all of the crevices. I'll usually do at least a couple rounds of dark washes, building up the dark color in the areas that might naturally be in shadow. Since HDU is porous, I wanted to seal any that was left exposed. You could do this using Drylock, but I decided to try using DAP 230 caulk instead. I made sure to cover every bit of exposed HDU and all of the seams and screw holes that I might have missed earlier. Even though the water would be contained in a tub, it could still easily splash or spill out. The DAP would prevent any mold or bacteria buildup in the future. I wasn't really worried about what the bottom looked like since it would never really be seen. You can use silicone, but as I mentioned in the intro, my experience hasn't been great with it so far, and the Reptile Safe silicone isn't paintable either. DAP 230 is a much better option for sealing PVC enclosures as well, as it actually bonds with the plastic. Just make sure that you always give it a full 10 to 14 days to fully off-gas before you expose your animals to it. Dry brushing highlights on rock is one of my favorite parts of the process. It really makes your textures pop. I used a photo I'd found on iNaturalist as a reference for my color scheme. I used wet sea sponges to dab a couple different green colors for mossy accents. Adding washes with browns helped provide some extra depth, and since I felt like my white highlights were a little too bright, I added a final light wash of dark gray at the end to take the brightness down a notch. I don't show it here, but after I finish painting, I always paint on at least 2 coats of Eco Poly Matte Clear Sealant. This not only keeps your colors from being damaged, but creates a strong, UV-resistant, and easily cleanable finish to your piece, and it's completely safe for use around your reptiles. You can use disinfectant and cleaning products with a scrub brush and your beautiful colors won't chip or fade. Using the little bottom filter was such an improvement on the pump. This allowed me to keep the electricity outside of the enclosure entirely, and I'd be able to easily remove the filter for cleaning when I needed to. But to make it work, I needed to drill a hole for the air hose through the back of the frame and in the side of the enclosure. I got lucky. The tub was sitting at exactly the right height below the top for the air hose to fit without preventing it from sitting flush with the frame. This was actually just dumb luck. So if you're planning to do something like this, I definitely recommend double checking your measurements ahead of time. The next step was drilling a hole just large enough to slide the air hose through the outside of the enclosure where it would connect to the pump. The larger holes you see next to it are for added ventilation that I installed in the enclosure wall. I'll put a link to this aquarium filter and aerator in the description. This one comes with a motor to power it, as well as an air stone you could use instead of the filter. Air stones are a good option for smaller water bowls. They'll keep the water slightly fresher, but you'll still need to regularly clean them as they build up with algae if left unchecked, and change out the water frequently to keep it from getting gross. Whereas if you use the filter with its sponge and bioball media, your water will be cleaner as well as oxygenated, and you'll need to do less frequent water changes. The fabrication part of this build was finally complete, and while I waited another 10 days for the materials and coatings to fully cure and off-gas, I tested the lighting and heating and gathered the rest of the plants and materials I'd need to set it up as a bioactive enclosure. I actually ended up swapping the sponge media for a carbon filter sponge media, which absorbs chlorine, contaminants, and odors from the water, traps debris, and stores beneficial bacteria. Because the bin was white, I decided to add river stones and some volcanic rock to it to make it look more natural. You can boil them in a pot of water on the stove or scrub them with mild soap and water to clean them first. I use purified water for all of my snake's water bowls, and I'd recommend that or at least filtered spring water, as tap water is often chlorinated and high in hard minerals like calcium and magnesium. That's what creates those water stains that are nearly impossible to get off water dishes. The river stones could help keep my plants in place. I used lucky bamboo and pothos, which can both grow without soil. The plant roots naturally absorb nitrates from the water, helping to keep it clean. At first the water looked a little murky, but that would be quickly remedied once the filter got to work. Adding floating plants like duckweed also keeps the water clean and looks really pretty to boot. As for water changes, depending on whether your snake pees or poops in there, you really don't need to do complete water changes for something like this, just as you wouldn't in a planted fish tank. Doing so removes the beneficial bacteria. So instead, I do a 60 to 80% water change every 3 to 4 weeks using a simple aquarium siphon vacuum, and top the levels off with more purified water as needed for water loss through evaporation. So far, Elora has only defecated in there once, but other species like boas are known to enjoy using their water bowls as a toilet. So you'll just need to base your maintenance off of your snake's particular habits. However, upkeep with this water feature is 10 times easier and more effective than the first one I built, looks more natural, and Elora seems pleased with it as well. After I finished this one, I actually updated Severus's water feature to have a filter and plants as well. If this video was helpful or inspiring to you, make sure to hit that like button before you go, share it with your friends, and consider joining my Patreon to show support. Thanks to all of my current patrons, they get exclusive posts, tips, and content, early releases on videos, first dibs and discounts on my art and handmade products, and plenty of other fun perks to boot. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time for more snake therapy.